Hello YouTube. One of the lore questions that I get asked the most over the last couple of weeks since Oblivion Remastered's release is: Skyrim had Dwemer ruins, they were really cool. Why are they not in Oblivion? And why is there Dwemer armor in Oblivion but no ruins? Explain, lore man. Well, the short answer is because the Dwemer never settled in Cyrodiil, and people took their ancient armor from the places where they did live, like Morrowind, Skyrim and Hammerfell, to Cyrodiil, which is why we have their armor. Now, the long answer as to why they never settled in Cyrodiil in the first place is quite a bit more complicated, and I'll answer it after the intro. So, the Dwemer. Despite often being called the Dwarves, they are actually one of the races of Elf of Tamriel, as Dwemer quite literally translates to Deep Elf, or elves that live in the deep. They are one of Tamriel's oldest races of elf, as they seem to have been among the very first who settled on the continent. You see, in the traditional origin story of the elves, it is said that a common ancestor to all elves, called the Aldmer, once lived on the ancient continent of Aldmuris, somewhere southwest of Tamriel. That continent, where all the ancestors lived, faced some unspecified and strange doom, and thus the elves were forced to flee the continent and search for a new homeland. The traditional legend then goes that the elves that fled the continent originally found the Somerset Isles, where they then eventually founded a new civilization, and after a while splinter groups split off from the society on the Somerset Isles, going towards Tamriel, where they became the Ayleid Elves of the Heartland, the Snow Elves of Skyrim, the Chimer of Morrowind, who eventually became the Dark Elves of the Dwemer, and perhaps also the Bosmer, although the Bosmer may have their own origin story, but that's not completely relevant for this video. But if you want to know more about the elvish actions from their ancient homeland, where I also discuss several theories, like if Aldmuris ever existed at all, a video on Aldmuris is in the description. Alright, now there's essentially two theories then as to how the Dwemer came to be. Either the Dwemer were a separate group who fled from Aldmuris to Tamriel, so separate from the group of elves who landed on the Somerset Isles in the first place, or they were part of the migration to the Somerset Isles and then basically left as the very first splinter group. It's most likely either of those theories, as we know that many aspects of original Dwemer culture, like law and even the Dwemer alphabet, are actually really similar to the ancient Aldmer culture, law and alphabet. Meaning that it's more or less certain that they at least share a common origin with all the other types of elves on the continent. Now, no matter on whether or not they arrived separately or really quickly splintered off, we know that the original Dwemer eventually came to Tamriel, where they started their own civilization, most likely as one of the first or the very first civilization of elves on the continent, as when later migrations of elves from the Somerset Isles to Tamriel started happening, they found the Dwemer to already be on Tamriel, in the northeast of the continent in modern day Morrowind. Now, back then they called Morrowind Dwemereth, where their civilization originally started and where they started building their grand underground cities. They became far more advanced technologically than any race on Tamriel had ever been before or would be for millennia, as they harnessed the power of technology, souls and steam. It's theorized by many that the reason that they originally settled in Morrowind and had such a presence on Vvardenfell, where the Red Mountain is, long before the Heart of Lorkhan was found by them, that is maybe because they wanted to harness the volcanic heat of the area for their steam technology, which is a pretty cool theory, but to be fair, we don't really know why they settled there. That's just a community theory. Now, once they had established themselves, their culture became one of cold reason and technological development, as they rejected the gods, believing them not to be worthy of worship, and rather, at least eventually, they strove to become gods themselves through technology, which would eventually lead them to try and build their own god, which could lift them to divinity, the so-called Numidium or the brass god, but that's not super relevant for this video. What is relevant, however, is that once they settled in Morrowind and built their cities, they had several different cooperating city-states living in relative harmony, despite there sometimes being conflicts. However, at one point a group of Aldmer from the Somerset Isles migrated away from the Somerset Isles and exiled themselves to Tamriel under their leader, the Prophet Valeth. These people settled in modern day Morrowind as well and became the elvish Chimer race, which eventually became the Dwemer. This led to an interesting division where Morrowind was split up in an above land, mostly controlled by the Chimer, which they called Resdain, and the underground Dwemereth, where the Dwemer had power. Now, this division was less than peaceful, and the two peoples, Chimer and Dwemer, often fought one another in conflict. However, in the early First Era, something interesting happened. You see, the early Nords of Skyrim launched an attack into Morrowind, trying to conquer Morrowind for the Nordic Empire. This forced the Dwemer and the Chimer eventually to work together to oppose the Nord, and so the so-called Alliance of the First Council was made between the Dwemer and the Chimer, with the most powerful king of the Dwemer, Dumak, and the eventual war leader of the Chimer, in the real Nerevar, making an alliance against the Nords. However, some Dwemer did absolutely not agree with this, and so they said, "We're out of here," as they no longer wanted to live with those who would ally themselves with the Chimer, and so the Dwemer migrations to the west started. First there was Clan Rurkan, whose leader, according to legend, threw the magical warhammer Volendrung into the sky and then vowed that he and his people would settle wherever it would land. The hammer then shot across the sky to the other end of Tamriel, and the hammer fell in modern-day Hammerfell, which was the place where the hammer fell. Nice naming scheme, Bethesda. Anyway, he and his clan trekked across Tamriel to get away from Morrowind and settle in Hammerfell, where they would found several Dwemer cities, including the legendary city of Volenfell, across the deserts and the different islands of Hammerfell, becoming the prosperous Rurkan Dwemer. It was also around this time that another clan, Clan Kragan, also decided to leave Morrowind. They travelled westwards to Skyrim, where there were already some smaller mining colonies, and these colonies then grew out to Skyrim's independent Dwemer city-states that would eventually go on to populate Blackreach and mine it for its Ethereum. They were also the ones who eventually enslaved and corrupted the Snow Elves, and who would nearly destroy themselves in the Ethereum Wars. What's interesting to realize here is that this migration to the west happened very late in the Dwemer's existence, starting somewhere around the year 200 of the First Era with the first mining colonies, and then apparently ending with the final migrations to the west around the year 400, while at that point the Dwemer had existed for at least 1,000 years in Morrowind. And meanwhile, the Dwemer themselves as a race would disappear only 300 years later after the Battle of Red Mountain, when the activation of their artificial god, the Numidium, led to essentially their entire race being deleted. Even those who had nothing to do with the artificial god, like the ones in Hammerfell and Skyrim, they were just suddenly all gone, because of the actions of those in Morrowind. Now, within those 300 years, the Dwemer did make smaller colonies in other parts of Tamriel. For example, some of Clan Kragan's men also travelled a little bit into High Rock somewhere in those years, and some of the Rurkan Dwemer sailed out into the western seas to colonize some islands, but they never ventured into Cyrodiil, and the reason for that may well be that the Aelids, another type of elf, already had a large, partially underground civilization there, and thus it would be a hard place to colonize for them without having to wage war against the Aelids. Meanwhile, in both Hammerfell and Skyrim, nobody controlled the underground yet. Another reason may well be that they had no real reason to go there. I mean, the only reason that they settled in Skyrim at all was apparently because of the valuable ore there to be found, and the pre-existence of some small mining colonies that had been founded for that ore. And they went to Hammerfell because that's where the hammer fell, which made it some new promised land in their mythology. So most likely that, in combination with the presence of the already underground building Aelids, likely prevented the Dwemer from settling in Cyrodiil. Although it's very much possible that if the Dwemer of Hammerfell and Skyrim would have had more time and would not be deleted along with their kinsmen in Morrowind, that they would have eventually travelled to Cyrodiil and founded some colonies there. I mean, I wouldn't even be surprised if someday we get an official add-on or something for Oblivion Remastered which places some old Dwemer mining outposts somewhere in the border mountains, but as of now we have no proof of it yet. And like I said in the intro, just because the Dwemer didn't live there, doesn't mean that their equipment harvested from their ancient ruins in the surrounding provinces would not make its way to Cyrodiil, the trading heartland of the continent. So likely because traders who will buy ancient Dwemer armor from adventurers and delvers, these traders will bring it from different provinces into Cyrodiil, which is why we can buy Dwemer equipment in Cyrodiil in Oblivion. That being said, those are the long and short answers to this video. If you enjoyed it and want to know more about the Elder Scrolls lore, I recommend going to the description where I put several links to other videos, in case you want to know more about some of the subjects that I mentioned. For example, there you can find a detailed video on the Rurkan Dwemer clan's exile to Hammerfell, a video on how Skyrim's Dwemer betrayed some of the Snow Elves and turned them into the slaves that we eventually see devolving into the Falmer. There will also be a video on the Aelid Empire which I did recently and which explains how the Aelids did settle in Cyrodiil, unlike the Dwemer, and there will be an interesting video which shows some of the ancient relations between the Aelid Empire and the Dwemer outposts in Hammerfell, which I thought would be interesting. Alright, now that's basically all that I can say about this subject, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and that you managed to learn something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. I realize it was a bit of a beginner's topic, but still, I thought it worthy to mention since I've gotten this question about 7 times since Oblivion's release. So, hey, I figured why not answer it. And now, all that remains for me to be done is to vocally thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, His Soul, King Chris 20, RB Dash, Steve G, Volkure of Argonia, Rakai, Sword of Bushido, and Mr. Christmas. These wonderful people, along with all the other people on screen, so my Patreon subscribers and my YouTube members, make my weekly videos possible, and for that I am very grateful. That being said, I will see you all in the next lore video. Bye bye.